Ian Murray is Labour MP for Edinburgh South and Shadows Scotland Secretary. To my left, Kirsty Blackman is SNP MP for Aberdeen North and the party's Cabinet Office spokesperson in Westminster. And David Mundell is Conservative MP for Dumfriesshire and a former Scotland Secretary in the governments of David Cameron and Theresa May. The number that you need to ask our panel a question is 0845 6060 973. You can text 84850. You can use Alexa to send in a question. Just say send a comment to LBC and then say your question. And don't forget to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Gina Davidson, let me ask you a question first. Let's break all precedent. What would you say were the four top political issues in Scotland right now? Let's assume independence is one of them, but what might our callers like to call in about?
I can't include independence. No. Okay. Well, we have to talk about transgender rights. Obviously, that has been in the headlines for the last 2 months at least, as the bill has gone through Holyrood, and now we've had this issue in the prison service. So that is one of them. I would suggest the economy is the other, and Brexit and its impact on Scotland's economy. I would say the use of Section 35, I suppose that's linked to the transgender row, the Section 35 issue that the UK government has used to block a piece of legislation for the first time ever, and the impact that has on devolution. And then I would say the NHS and the state of Scotland's NHS, which I'm quite sure Kirsty will say later, is still better than the state of England and Wales's NHSs, but it's not in good health.
And of course, there's teacher strikes today. We had those awful drug deaths figures last week as well. But lots of other subjects you might want to phone in about. 0345 6060 973. Well, Murdo in Fife actually chose his question before you gave that list, but he's asking about your first suggestion here. Hello, Murdo.
Hi there, Ian. How are you this evening?
Very well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
Well, quite simply, is the trans prisoner scandal the beginning of the end for Nicola Sturgeon?
Kirsty Blackman.
No. I mean...
Feel free to elaborate.
Nicola Sturgeon is going to be the First Minister for some time to come, and she's going to be the leader of the SNP for some time to come. There is no suggestion of anything else. And, I think that the way this has been handled has... we've looked into the issue. The issue's been looked into. The prisoner... particularly that was mentioned last week, has been in the news quite a lot. They are not being held in the female
But there has
state.
been a U-turn on this, hasn't there? Whenever a politician makes a U-turn, they're automatically assumed to be weaker.
I don't think there has been a U-turn on this. The prison service have been undertaking a review into the housing of transgender prisoners for some time now, and that is the case, that review has been undertaken. It is not the case that trans female prisoners are currently held that have had any kind of violent crimes towards women, for example, have been held on the women's estate anyway.
But this one was.
There is a situation where, while an assessment is taking place, prisoners are held in a segregation situation. The prison service is very good at segregating people. I mean, that's literally what they do while an assessment is undertaken. But there was no intention to house this particular prisoner long term in Cornton Vale.
But this prisoner was in a women's prison. I mean, admittedly, you're right, obviously segregated. But, and then they were moved.
In terms of the assessment process was done. I think we need to allow the prison service to do the assessment process. They do the assessment process. That's how it works. So they undertake an assessment. They work out which estate is best to keep prisoners in. They work out, for all prisoners, is this prisoner going to be a danger to other prisoners? And they undertake those assessments and are pretty good, as I say, at keeping people in segregation.
I was watching a clip of Nicola Sturgeon this afternoon being asked on ITV News about this. And for the first time, I saw her completely flailing. I mean, she's a very, very confident and good media performer. She was all over the place on this. And I think that's possible. I mean, I'll ask Murdo in a minute if that's what's prompted his question. But all politicians have a shelf life, and they're all sort of have to go at some point. She's been in the job for 9 years. She has slightly considered her own future over the last year, started to sort of speculate about it. I mean, obviously, you can't say where she's going to leave on December the 31st, 2026 or whatever. But, I mean, any politician who's been in the job for 9 years, people are always going to speculate.
And she's still incredibly popular. She is still an incredibly popular politician. If you compare her to anybody who has been in a leadership role for that long, she has got a significant amount of popular support. Having seen how she performed during COVID, for example, she was incomparable. She was streets ahead of what we were seeing from the politicians down here. And I think, as a result of what happened with Jacinda Ardern, she was asked if she has still had gas in the tank, and Nicola Sturgeon was very clear that she's still got plenty of gas in the tank to continue to lead Scotland.
I'm just trying to think of a Scottish phrase for gas in the tank, but I'm sure one will come to me. Iain Murray for Labour. The question is the recent trans prisoner scandal the beginning of the end of Nicola Sturgeon?
I think it's a symptom of something much bigger. I mean, it's quite clear that for the last few weeks, Nicola Sturgeon's been adamant that this is a decision for the prison service and only the prison service, until the press, the media and the public decided it was going to be a big issue. And then she's decided to intervene. I think this has been going on since 2014 in terms of Nicola Sturgeon promising stricter guidelines and better guidelines in terms of where prisoners go in Scotland. And I think today's TV clip that you talked about where she was flailing is a symptom of the fact that she doesn't really believe in this stuff, but she does intervene when the public and the media decide it's going to be an issue. And that will trip her up eventually. Well, she said for a long time, to dodge the question, that it's a matter for the prison service. And she does this in a whole host of things. The crisis in the NHS is someone else's fault. The crisis in education is someone else's fault. Teachers are on strike in Scotland because it's someone else's fault. The bin men were on strike last year and it was someone else's fault. But then the public and the media take an interest and then she decides to intervene. And that's what she's done on this particular issue as well.
Isn't that what all national politicians do, though? I mean, it's
much more
unique to her.
Well, maybe not, but it's much more pronounced in this particular instance. Maybe you could say the Prime Minister's done the same with the Deems Highway and some other instances that he's been involved in just recently. But it is a symptom of the problem in Scottish politics at the moment. The Scottish Parliament, I think, doesn't really work and operate properly as a scrutinising body. A single chamber doesn't work properly as a scrutinising body. The First Minister is all-powerful. Her own backbenchers don't say boo to a mouse. Particularly maybe on this issue, one or two have, but over the course of their being in government for the last 15 years, I think you could count on one hand the number of people that have rebelled, let alone the number of issues. So there's little scrutiny, and I think that makes for bad law, makes for bad government. Single chamber was
set up by Labour. You didn't seem to have a problem with it when Labour was in power there.
I'm saying that we have to look at the way that the Scottish Parliament operates. I think there's a lot of MSPs from all parties that are concerned that the scrutiny of the committee system, etc., isn't strong enough, and there is a reform proposal on the table from the Labour Party. Look at all of this in the round. It's not a criticism, Kirsty, of the Scottish Parliament. We're very proud the way we set it up, but I think if you
including Section 35.
Well, Section 35 was set up to underpin devolution. This was set up by Donald Dewar to make sure the Scottish Parliament could legislate in devolved areas without having to think about cross-border consequences. It should never have to be used, but it was there for the intention to allow the Scottish Parliament and to facilitate the Scottish Parliament to pass laws in devolved areas. It should never have been used in this instance because we should never have got this far, but I bet, and I'll be asking the government this tomorrow, since the government instigated Section 35, I bet there hasn't been one conversation between both governments about how this could be resolved, because it's not in their interest to resolve it.
Is that true? I don't know if anybody...
I think there has been conversations between Shona Robinson, who's the Cabinet.
I'll come to you in a minute, Gina. David Mundell.
Well, I don't know whether it's the beginning of the end of Nicola Sturgeon, but I certainly think that it is an example of the fact that, she's not the godlike figure that she was once promoted as, and she makes mistakes, and this is a bad mistake. There was an amendment brought forward by an SNP MSP in the Scottish Parliament in relation to the GRR that would have dealt under different rules with people who were subject to serious sexual offences that were in the criminal justice system. And Nicola Sturgeon took the view that amendment had to be faced down. SNP MSPs were ordered to vote it down. Now, in the past, I think Nicola Sturgeon would have at least checked to make sure were there any such people in the system who were going to come forward and cause this sort of issue? And she didn't, she didn't do that. She just let it all unfold. And as you said, Iain, I mean, in that clip on ITV, she's just flailing. She's just filling the interview with words, with no clear policy position. I've usually, because of the actions of others, I had to go on and make a defence, put a case. But Nicola Sturgeon in this case was the decision maker. All the votes in the Scottish Parliament on this bill, Nicola Sturgeon decided how SNP MSPs voted.
So one or two of them did rebel, I think. Wasn't there a minister that resigned over?
There was. There was a minister that resigned. There was a group of MSPs with their own party who were critical, who brought forward, for example, this amendment about sex offenders. But again, it was just faced down and voted down.
And well done to Ash Regan for standing up. Whether you believe in her position or not, she stood up to Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, which is something that very few do. She's an MSP and part of my own constituency. Doesn't say a peep about the NHS crisis, a peep about the education stuff, all the stuff that's devolved. But thankfully, she said stuff on this and rebelled, and that's very unusual.
Gina, for people south of the border, this has been of great interest over the past week. We've covered it a lot on LBC. Where does it hang now? And what's your answer to Murdo's? I nearly said Murdo Fraser's question there.
Have you double-checked?
I don't think it was him. But Murdo's question: is the recent trans prisoner scandal the beginning of the end of Nicola Sturgeon?
I think probably for critics of Nicola Sturgeon, that's a bit of wishful thinking. I mean, she's very clear that she's going to stay on until at least the next Scottish Parliament elections. And of course, the problem the SNP has, there's nobody to replace her. So she will be there until there is somebody that she feels able to take over in that position. And I think it's worth saying that this is a problem that her government has created for itself, because it has just refused to listen to any concerns about the GRR. This has nothing to do with that particular piece of legislation, because this policy by the prison service has been in operation ahead of that. But it has been that policy creep, as it's called. People have known that that's the way that the Scottish Government has been moving, that they want to have this self-declaration, self-identification of gender, and that should trump biological sex. And ultimately people said, well, this is the end result of that. So if you're saying trans women are women in all cases, then where does that lead? And they say that leads to rapists being in the women's estate. I don't think... It's interesting, David mentions that in the past there might have been more on top of whether or not these issues were likely to come up. So I think that's an example of a government that's been there a long time and has maybe just taken its foot off the pedal bit with having its T's crossed and its I's dotted. But the backlash to it has been fascinating, and I think for a lot of people, a lot of independent supporters I see on social media who are now, rethinking everything they think about Nicola Sturgeon, about independence in the light of this particular issue now is absolutely fascinating. So the next set of polls about popularity will be interesting to see, because Nicola Sturgeon's has been sliding. She's still positive while other leaders are negative, but it'll be interesting to see if it dips below the zero.
Quick comeback from you, Murdo.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear everyone's views. It is the end of Nicola, and she's a very clever politician, but, maybe doing a Jacinda Ardern would do her long-term credibility no harm, because what you had, the whole debate, and then the prisoner thing, bang, it couldn't have happened at a worst possible time, and folk that were going, what's this all about, the person on the street are going, no, enough's enough. And people I'm speaking to now who are, through COVID, quite rightly, Nicola Sturgeon did a grand job, but people have just, you ask them and they're just shaking their heads. So as a proud unionist, but I'm quite happy to see the demise of the SNP. But, Nicola's done a great job. I think at the moment, for her credibility, it's like, just exit stage left and reinvent herself, because she's a very clever person. I'm quite sure she'll be thinking of her situation, thinking, maybe it's time to go. So that's my view.
Wishful thinking, I think, Murdo. Thank you very much indeed for that question. Keep your calls coming. Gordon says, where does it hang now? Do you want to rephrase that, Iain? Did I genuinely say that? whatever. It's entirely possible. We'll come to more questions in just a minute. 17 minutes past 8.
LBC. Tackle. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
We have Kirsty Blackman from the SNP, David Mundell from the Conservatives, Ian Murray from Labour and Gina Davidson from LBC, which is not a new political party. Yet. You never know. Now, I was waiting for a text like this. It's from Diane in Edinburgh. Why is your panel made up of 3 unionists and 1 indie person? The latest poll details that 47% of Scots support independence. You should have a 50-50 split. Well, we're very careful in how we do our panels, and what we wanted to have was a representative from the 3 main political parties in Scotland, plus Gina, who's our Scotland political editor. I don't think you can accuse this programme of being anti-SNP in any way. We had a whole hour with Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP in Westminster, last week, and then he was followed by Richard Thompson, another SNP MP, on Cross Question. So I hope Kirsty will agree, we do give the SNP a fair crack of the whip.
I understand that you're right, that Stephen was on it and that Richard was on it, and both of them are excellent. I'm sure there are many more of my colleagues who would love to come on, so if you want to extend the invitation.
In fact, we had one of them asked to come on today. No names, no patch, I'll tell you in the break. Right, let's go to another question. It's an Alexa question from Jay. I'm in Year 9 in England, the equivalent of S2 in Scotland. The teacher strikes are affecting my English and maths homework and my wider education. How can these teacher strikes be resolved? Now, members of Scotland's largest teaching union, the Educational Institute of Scotland, are currently in the middle of 16 days of strikes, with teachers in different local authority areas striking on different days. Teachers in England and Wales in the National Education Union will be taking part in a national strike this Wednesday and Friday. And we have Mary Bousted from the National Education Union on Cross Question. Is it tomorrow or Wednesday? I think it's tomorrow. So let's go to Ian Murray on this.
Well, the first thing you have to do is to try and find a way to negotiate. There hasn't been a new offer to Scottish teachers for over 2 months. So they've been out on strike without any new offer coming forward. So that has to be resolved. We've seen with the partially with the nursery strikes in Scotland, the Scottish Government said there's no way we can increase the offer, and then miraculously the money came forward to increase the offer and resolved partially, not with the RCN and others, but partially with some of the nurseries unions in Scotland. So you have to get around the table to negotiate. And what's happening is the chickens are coming home to roost. We've had over a decade now in our public services of wage stagnation. In fact, I think we released some figures last week that showed that the average public sector wage in Scotland was £800 lower today than it was in 2010. That's 12 years ago. In my own constituency in Edinburgh, it's 6,000. So you can see what's happening to public sector workers being squeezed out of the big expensive cities as well. So there has to be a negotiation. The government have to get around the table, and they've got to loosen the purse strings, because until they do...
By how much?
Well, that's up for the negotiation. I'm not going to sit here and pluck a figure out there. No politician's going to do that.
Labour representatives never do. I mean, Keir Starmer won't say what he thinks NHS staff should be given. Surely that's political leadership to say, well, I think they should be given this.
No, but because a negotiation doesn't work that way. A negotiation, you sit down, you listen to both sides, and you come to a mutual agreement that both sides can agree on. Plucking a figure out there undermines that. That's why we won't do so. It's not the way you negotiate these things to be done. But I feel sorry for the pupils in Year 9 and second year, because they are at the peak of what they should be doing at school. They've just gone through COVID, and I'm sure the message that's come in from a Year 9 would have been in primary 7, perhaps, in the last year of junior school during COVID, so didn't go through that transition as well. So it's really impacting people's education.
I read a stat the other day that said that if you're taking your GCSEs, presumably is that Highers in Scotland, you will have only had one uninterrupted year of education, either because of COVID or strikes. I mean, that's terrible, isn't it?
Well, I went to school, and I was at primary school during the 80s with the teacher strikes, the last big teacher strikes, and they have to be resolved because it fundamentally impacts not just educational standards but everything else that you do. I think school football and sport, for example, only took a decade to recover from the teacher strikes. So look, the government, the unions, the teachers, COSLA, the governing body for Scottish local authorities, have to get round the table to resolve this, but more money has to be put on the table, and if there's not been something coming forward for over 2 months now, I don't see any quick fix to this.
And Gina, how likely is that? I mean, you've obviously been covering this in your role as Scotland editor. I mean, it sort of reflects a lot of the strikes in England as well, where there are no new offers coming.
Nothing. There's nothing. And Iain said the last 2 months, there's been nothing since last August. It's the same offer that's been on the table, this 5% to the teaching unions. I think there was some movement around the margins for newly qualified teachers to get slightly more. So they have, been sitting down together and trying to come to some sort of deal, some sort of compromise, but with no new deal. I think the unions are just saying, well, there's nothing to talk about, there's nothing to discuss here. We can have these meetings, the Scottish Government says they're constructive, but in what way are they constructive if they're not, coming to any conclusion? I mean, my children are off school tomorrow because of the strikes. That's the third day that they will have missed because of the strikes.
And you aren't even there to tell them to do their homework.
Well, exactly. Well, their father will do that. But it is very difficult, and they have had their education upturned because of COVID, and things were just getting back on an even keel, and now there's the strikes. I think at the minute most parents and the public feel supportive of the teachers because, I mean, they're not the only ones obviously that are out on strike, and people think that public service workers should get some more money, but the problem the Scottish Government has, of course, is they have John Swinney as the Finance Secretary saying he can't even balance the books for this year. There's a problem generally because of inflation in terms of balancing the books, and that's a legal requirement, so we're still waiting to see if they're going to resolve that, and that's before they start talking about pay awards next year, when there'll be even more demands. So the government are in a really sticky place here, but there's going to have to ultimately be some more money found from somewhere, and they managed it with the nurses, they managed it with the refuse collectors and so on, and that was when Nicola Sturgeon got around the table. That's when the deal was done, so I think we might have to see that again.
And are Scottish teachers' salaries out of kilter with English, or I mean, I don't know.
Well, I'm sure Kirsty will probably say, but they're well paid in comparison to teachers south of the border, but they'll point to their hours and their classroom teaching time and the balance that doesn't add up for them there. So there's a lot more than just salary, but they have seen obviously a degradation in their salaries because of inflation. Just as the
Macron deal 20 years ago gave the teachers 23% increase in Scotland, which is given the differentials.
David Mundell.
Yeah, well, it's very disappointing. I mean, in the Scottish Borders part of my constituency, the strike was on today, and it's difficult for pupils, it's difficult for families with the arrangements that they have to make. But ultimately, the Scottish Government do have to get round the table. There's the financial issue, as we would obviously also understand, but there are terms and conditions, parts of it Gina's touched on, that the sort of working hours and prep time and all these things. So, I mean, clearly there is scope for negotiation. I mean, maybe it does require Nicola Sturgeon herself to get involved, because as we saw with other disputes, it seems that she calls all the shots, and unless she comes forward and wants a resolution, there isn't going to be one.
Kirsty?
I mean, it's a very different situation to here because we have to balance our budget, as Gina said. You know, the Scottish Government's budget has to be balanced. I just want to mention just a couple of things. In terms of striking workers, absolutely support people's right to strike, and, you know, what's happening in Westminster today around the strikes is horrific. But I want to be clear that some of the stuff that people are striking for across the board is not just about pay. No. So we need to be absolutely clear about that. I don't want anybody being critical of striking workers because they believe it is entirely down to pay. It is not. In a lot of cases, there's significant other issues that people are concerned about. And I just want to pick up the education disruption in relation to strikes compared to COVID. Of my children are of primary school age, and the disruption from COVID is incomparable to the disruption from a couple of days off from strikes.
16 days.
I'm not disagreeing. 16 days. My children have got 2 days off with strikes so far. It's
a rolling programme.
It's not six. Nobody in Scotland is suffering from 16 days of strike off school. Right. It's 1 day. You know, that's not a comparable thing. However, it is the case that education is being disrupted. I'm not going to disagree that I'm just saying that we can't compare the two things.
There's going to be increasing pressure on Nicola Sturgeon to resolve this, because the EIS, the union you mentioned, is already talking about disrupting the exams this year. And as a parent who's middle child who will be sitting her exams this year, it's like, I really do not want that to happen. So, parents are going to be saying, get this sorted out before we're in any... before that happens.
That would be unforgivable, surely, to disrupt exams.
I mean, given how disrupted exams have been over the last few years, I don't think it would be great for anyone for that situation to happen. We have got, just Gina was mentioning some of the things around the fact that the Scottish teachers are paid more. Scottish teachers have also got fewer children per teacher. So they're already again ahead in that regard to south of the border, but we just don't have the flexibility in our budgets that the government here do. And if the government was to strike a significant pay deal with teachers here, that would result in Barnett consequentials for Scotland. That would result in an increased budget for Scotland as a result of decisions that are made here.
But spending is about priorities. Always about priorities. There's a £2 billion underspend last year. There's money on foreign embassies. There's money that was set aside for independence referendums, albeit I admit has now been put back into the pot. Spending is about priorities, and whilst the Scottish Government have to balance the books, they don't have a fixed budget. So let's not be under any illusions that there's no money there. Money can be found. It was found for the nurseries. It was found for the refuse dispute. So this needs to be resolved.
But you can't find money for everybody that's demanding it, can you? And that by definition, you can't do.
But you've got to find a way through this. And I think David's right. Until the First Minister gets involved, this will continue.
But if you're taking it out of one pot, you've got to identify what that pot might be.
Well, the budget is proposing an increase in income tax that will bring more money into the Scottish budget.
That's for next year.
It's for next year, yes. But the point I'm trying to make is that let's not mislead listeners that this is a fixed budget. It's not a fixed budget. Yes, it has to be balanced, but it's not a fixed budget.
But in year, we can't make those changes, and this is what the negotiations are about. It's about this year, not about next year, and that, is another hurdle that we'll have to cross at that point. But, in year, I mean, if your colleagues or if yourself has got suggestions about what we should cut, and your MSPs want to propose those things in Holyrood, please do. Please do make proposals about exactly what it is you want to
close down the foreign embassies. Don't spend money on independence referenda.
So how much money does that save this year?
And put the money into the pot where people need to be paid properly, which is our teachers. Don't keep slashing local government. Use the underspend. Give all the money to local government where it's been cut in recent years, because they're directly responsible for education.
And where are you getting the money from?
Put the money into education. So the bottom line here is that politics is about priorities, and there's some examples of where you could not spend and waste money. £500 million to underwrite the Gupta deal, money for organisations that have gone bust, for business deals. All of that is just wasted money down the tubes that could be going into pensioners to teachers' pocket.
Okay, right.
Going into pensioners' pockets as well, if that's what you choose.
We'll move on in just a moment. Somebody says, great panel, perfectly fair representation. So we've got one fan anyway. Right, it's 8:31.
That's Fraser from
8:31 on LBC. Let's get the latest news headlines from Charlotte Morgan.
Firefighters have voted to strike in what could be their first walkout in 2 decades. The fire brigade union's offering the government a 10-day window for pay negotiations. The Education Secretary says it's disappointing the NEU is going ahead with Wednesday's teachers' strike in England and Wales. Gillian Keegan's meeting with unions earlier failed to resolve their ongoing row over wages. And Labour says the government is setting the NHS up to fail with its latest plan for the health service. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, announced a £1 billion investment to cut waiting times. And LBC weather, showers for much of the country tonight, lows of 4, blustery showers in the north tomorrow, some rain in the west and a high of 11 Celsius.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It is.
It's 8:35 on LBC. With me on the Cross Question panel tonight, Kirsty Blackman from the SNP, David Mundell from the Conservatives, Ian Murray, Labour MP for Edinburgh South, and Gina Davidson, LBC Scotland political editor. Have I missed a sir off the front of your name? I've got a feeling I have, haven't I?
You haven't, but you could lobby for it.
Okay, I'll do that. No, I just suddenly had this. I'm sure we got a night
feel
ahead.
free to drop His Majesty a line.
Right, let's go to our next caller. It's our old friend James in Ayr. Hello, James.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening to your panel. This is a question about the political culture in Scotland. It's an open question, and it's a question I believe that isn't asked often enough. I'm 65 years old, and in my lifetime, the Conservative and Unionist Party has never won an election in Scotland. Why is that?
1955, I think, was the last time. David Mundell, why?
Well, firstly, I think, James, you'll find that during most of that period they have won the constituency in and around Ayr, but you're right, they haven't won the most number of seats in Scotland. But a United Kingdom general election isn't conducted within Scotland, it's conducted across the whole of the United Kingdom. And when we had the referendum in 2014, that issue was well debated. I appeared on numerous panels where people raised that issue and understood the context of remaining within the United Kingdom would be that we would have United Kingdom-wide elections. But within the Scottish Parliament, of course, the Scottish Conservatives are the official opposition with 31 MSPs. We're the party at Westminster with the second most MSPs and a significant number of councillors in local government in Scotland. So, the Scottish Conservatives are a force within Scottish politics, but we haven't achieved over 50% of the votes or seats within that timescale.
But why?
Well, I think because it's a democracy and people have chosen.
Is it because
people have chosen
is
to vote
basically a more left of centre country than England? Is that the reason? Because sort of decades, centuries ago, you wouldn't have said that, would you?
Well, I think if you look at, I don't want to get into too much boring detail, but if you look at the 1955 election, there were essentially two parties: there were Conservative or Labour.
So it's our fault.
That was the split, and as we've moved into a more plural system, then the support for the Conservatives.
So nothing to do with the policies at all.
Well, obviously, in that period there have been different results. Sometimes we've done very badly. 1979, when we got 0 MPs.
Did you? No,
yes.
you didn't. Malcolm Rifkin was elected.
No, I'm afraid. Sorry, 97. I'm getting my 7s and 9s the wrong way round. In 97,
did you go to school?
Yes, and I went to school before the teachers' strike as well.
Okay,
we got it the wrong way around, but it's been a variance over that period.
Kirsty.
So there's a number of things, and I'll probably talk in slightly more recent history than 1955, I'm afraid. We don't support Brexit. Scotland overwhelmingly doesn't support Brexit and still doesn't support Brexit. We do.
Nor did David, to be fair.
And, well, the Conservatives did, though, and stood on that platform. And I think that's how people are judging on the basis of manifestos. And we didn't say that we were going to have a vote for leaving the European Union, but the Conservatives did, and then continued to vote on getting Brexit done.
But I thought you believed in referendums and lots of them.
In terms of the referendum for leaving the EU, there was a number of issues with that, not least the fact that Scotland didn't get what it voted for. There was no situation where Scotland's voice could be heard in that because England is significantly bigger. Yes, sorry, I'll come back to.
We may come back to that later.
We do support trade unions, and that is historically why people have voted for the Labour Party, why people have voted for the SNP rather than the Conservatives in Scotland, because Conservatives are no big fan of trade unions. I think we are more left-wing. I think we're generally more comfortable with situations, less comfortable with some of the kind of trickle-down economics stuff, and a bit more comfortable with the idea of sharing the resources in a fair and equitable way. We also have voted for not the Conservative Party. I just want to talk about Labour in 1997 particularly, on the basis of the Scottish Parliament, on the basis of reform of the House of Lords, on the basis of some of those big changes that we felt needed to happen and did happen as a result of us not voting Conservative in 1997. We didn't quite not vote Conservative in 1992, but we got there in 1997 finally.
Okay, Gina.
I think the reason that Scotland hasn't returned a majority of Conservatives to Westminster anyway for so long is because of where the population lies in Scotland. You have vast constituencies in the north, in the islands and so on, but actually with small population numbers who have maybe more traditionally voted Conservative in the past or Liberal Democrat. Even SNP in Aberdeenshire way, Kirsty, where you're from, whereas that central belt where the vast majority of Scotland's population lies are much more, have voted Labour for much longer. And that's to do with poverty and deprivation and poor housing stock and the kind of jobs that Scotland, used to have on the Clyde and so on and so forth. And so it didn't make sense for those voters, I think, to vote Conservative. They weren't offering them anything, whereas for years they thought the Labour Party was offering them something. And then obviously that has changed and they thought the SNP is offering them what they want. Whether or not that will continue, we'll have to wait and see. But it seems, although Labour's having a bit of a resurgence, it'll be very difficult to eat into the number of MPs that the SNP has. So I think it's more to do with that. I don't know if Scotland is particularly more left-leaning. I know we like to think that about ourselves, but I think if you look at social studies and so on some of the big issues, we're more or less the same across the UK. Brexit has been a dividing line, I think, but in general, and on other social issues, we're all kind of about the same. But I think it's more to do, maybe Kirsty's right, about trade unionism, about jobs, about housing, about rights, and having that voice. And that's been Labour. And then and people now obviously think it's SNP.
Iain Murray.
Well, I think Gina's right. Deindustrialisation right across the Central Belt, the Conservatives were blamed for that. I also agree, Scotland's a very small C Conservative country, and all the social attitude survey show that broadly people in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland share the same views, whether they tend to be slightly centre-left views. Of course, there's variances across individual regions of England, but as a whole... But yes, the opportunity to vote for parties that were the opposite of what the Conservatives were offering was on the table, and Scots took that opportunity. If you look at all the way across west of Scotland through Glasgow, the Central Belt, into Edinburgh, that was just solid red for 5 decades, because of the way in which the population there felt the Conservatives were treating Scotland. And that still continues to a certain extent today. I think David's right to a certain extent. I think there was a renaissance for the Conservative Party under Ruth Davidson because she presented something different that wasn't traditional conservatism, and people warmed to that. And obviously that was heightened by the fact that there's this binary divide between yes and no in terms of the independence referendum. But I think now, minus 72 popularity rating for Boris Johnson when he resigned, minus 80 for Liz Truss, it's minus 40 or something at the moment for the current incumbent of Downing Street. That's the offer to Scots. And
it's Rishi Sunak, in case you forgot his name.
Well, there's been so many, it's difficult to keep track.
Right, just a brief follow-up text from Marion Paul. Is Nicola Sturgeon right to call Keir Starmer a pale imitation of a Tory? Now, she said that in an exclusive interview with our own Lewis Goodall on the Newsagents podcast last week. Iain?
No, I mean, it's completely ridiculous. And the reason that Nicola Sturgeon's saying that is she's reverting to her usual type of trying to believe that anybody who wants to not vote SNP is essentially a Tory. She knows her worst nightmare is Keir Starmer walking through Downing Street with a UK Labour government. She knows that's her worst nightmare. And
why
don't forget, in 2019 and 2017, she encouraged English voters, if they weren't voting, to vote Green, not to vote for any of the other.
Why is it her worst nightmare?
It's her worst nightmare because it takes the good debate and binary debate about the Constitution off the table. It means that those big bag Tories are no longer the pantomime villains that she can play off. It means that things like Section 35 don't happen. It means that there's a progressive UK Labour government delivering for the whole of the United Kingdom and trying to work constructively with all parts of the United Kingdom. She would not want that. And certainly, if you look at what's happened, particularly over the last 5 years at Westminster, that would all be wiped away with a credible Prime Minister with integrity and honesty, and that's what Scots are crying out for. And we just say to them, if you want a Labour government, you have to vote for it. And that is Nicola Sturgeon's worst nightmare.
Kirsty?
I mean, I've said a number of occasions, some of the things that we are doing here, some of the things the SNP are doing here, right? If they get passed into law, we're never going to see them happen because we're going to be an independent country. We want this place to be better when we leave it. We want it to continue to be better. It's still going to be our closest neighbour when we're independent. And, I certainly think that I would much rather have a Labour government in than a Conservative government, because I would much rather see people south of the border after independence have a Labour government than a Conservative one. But, I don't think that it's quite the issue that Iain Murray is suggesting that it is for Nicola Sturgeon. I think that we are managing still to continue to win against Labour. My seat was a Labour seat since 1934 or 1935 until I won it. And I got the biggest percentage majority in Scotland. I mean, people are not...
No need to brag.
Sorry.
Yes, but that's from the 2019 election.
People are not going back to Labour.
That was when Labour didn't look as if it could win. And rightly didn't look as if it could win because we were appallingly poor. Now we're offering a credible alternative at Westminster. Keir has maybe not the exact keys for number 10, but he's holding a set of keys at the moment. It looks as if he's going to be the next Prime Minister. It would take a brave person to bet against it, and Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want that. She would fears it.
I'm going to excuse David and Gina for answering this question, which they may be relieved at or not, but we're going to move on to something else in just a moment. It's 8:46.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Just right. Kirsty Blackman, David Mundell, Ian Murray and Gina Davidson with us answering your questions. Now here's a tweet question from Alexis, as opposed to the other thing. Scotland has had one of the highest rates of drug and alcohol addiction problems, as well as being Europe's heroin death capital for decades. When will the war on drugs end and drugs be decriminalised and instead treated as a public health issue? Look at Portugal's success with this. People always quote Portugal, and then you get other people say, no, it's not quite as simple as that. And I can never sort of get through the weeds of all of that. Gina, set out the issue.
Well, Alexis is right. Scotland has a terrible problem with drug deaths. 3 times as many drug deaths as in the rest of the UK. It has a terrible problem with alcohol consumption. In terms of heroin, I'm not sure that that's still the biggest issue. The biggest issue seems to be a mixing of drugs, particularly I'm going to mispronounce this, benzodiazepam type drugs with other things, which are causing these deaths. Now, the Scottish Government is already treating it as a public health issue. I mean, there is obviously a criminal justice issue as well, but in general, it is treated as a public health issue, and they've done an awful lot about making sure that people have naloxone. That's a drug that's available to help people if they go into overdose, can bring them back. They are looking at things like setting up drug consumption rooms. They don't, at the minute, I believe, have the capacity to do that. That's something that they're in discussion
Capacity
with.
or power?
Power. So they're in discussion with the UK government to look at that. I think there's going to be a members' bill brought forward by Paul Sweeney, one of Ian Murray's fellow members of Labour in the Scottish Parliament. So there's lots of action being taken on it. But if you speak to those at the front line, they feel there's not enough rehab beds, there's just not enough money being spent. As in anything with the NHS, the money is just not there to tackle it head on. In terms of alcohol, the Scottish Government is now looking at banning advertising in sport, stopping alcohol firms from being able to do that, even having alcohol behind grey shutters in shops like we have cigarettes. You can't see the packaging. Alcohol the same, to try and prevent people buying it the same. They've obviously had the minimum unit price scheme as well, so they are attempting to do things, but at the minute nothing appears to be working.
Ian Murray, this is a long-standing issue. What's Labour's policy on trying to make this? I mean, it's one of those things that there has to be a long-term strategy for, isn't it? You can't sort of have X number of deaths one year and then halve it the next year. It doesn't work like that.
No, and I think the figures out just in the last few weeks showed that drugs deaths have gone up again. Yeah. And it's a really peculiar thing, and nobody's really put their finger on it because, Kirsty will say we don't have the power to do X, Y and Z, but actually it's 3 times higher than it is in England with the same legislative and regulatory framework. So there must be a particular problem in Scotland. We fought for a long time against the slashing of drug rehabilitation centres and drug support services. Thankfully that money, or partially, has been put back in, £50 million I think in the last couple of years. But it's still a difficult nut to crack. It should be seen as a public health issue. And in fact, I think safe consumption rooms are operating at the moment illegally in some parts of Glasgow, but I think people turn a blind eye to the illegality of it because they are saving lives. But really, it's a long-term problem. I think it goes back to poverty, lack of opportunity, family breakdown, addiction. All of those things are a factor in this. And until you start tackling the root causes of all of those, I think it's very, very difficult to try and see how you get those drugs deaths down considerably to a much more one's too many. But 3,000, I think it is at the moment.
But the problems of poverty, say, for example, in Glasgow, are they really any different to various big English cities?
Probably not. But it's a combination of a lot of things. And that's why I said at the start, I'm not quite sure anybody's been able to put their finger on why Scotland has a specific problem with such considerably higher drugs deaths than anywhere else in Europe. But it's a combination of all of those things. So you're right, there'll be parts of England that are just in such abject poverty as parts of Scotland. You mentioned Glasgow as an example. But that will only be one small factor, and it would be really interesting to find out what is actually making Scotland unique in this regard. Alcohol is something slightly different. We've had a cultural problem with alcohol for centuries and will continue to have.
What about Edinburgh? Because I think most people in England think of Edinburgh as sort of much leafier and probably better off than Glasgow, but there will be parts of Edinburgh that are afflicted by these problems as well.
Well, my own constituency has 4 of the most expensive streets in Scotland and 4 of the poorest. Edinburgh has really
need a bit of levelling up.
Big deprivation. Well, we didn't get any levelling up funds, so perhaps Michael Gove wants to look at that. But so this is a difficult problem across all parts of Scotland. Rural Scotland has a really big problem. David will see that in his own constituency of poverty, of deprivation, of addiction, and that's a real issue too.
But you grew up in an area that had high levels of heroin use back in the 80s when Edinburgh was the heroin capital, and so it's not like that anymore.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is, if you are in that position with such high death rate, you've got to prioritise that as an issue. And at least for once, Nicola Sturgeon did have some humility to admit that she'd taken her eye off the ball in terms of dealing with this issue, and there wasn't evidence of a joined-up strategy. My colleagues in the Scottish Parliament brought forward a private member's bill for a right to recovery because most people don't actually have access to the support that they need to get off heroin and other drugs. And it's about bringing together all the agencies that are involved, because inevitably there are multiple agencies involved. There is just a chronic lack of support for the individuals. So because Scotland has this scale of problem, we've got to give it the priority that it deserves, and we have not been doing that.
Kirsty, I mean, this is a problem. I remember talking about this 10 years ago on the programme. It's a stain on the SNP government's record, isn't it?
Can I just first, nobody's really mentioned people. We've talked about numbers. And, you know, every person that dies death misusing drugs is a tragedy, and it's a tragedy for their family and for anybody that knows them as well. And you know, we need to remember the impact this is having on people's lives. And I think that's why we've had a situation where, and as a result of the task force report, we have got a cross-government work on this. We're actually spending 67% more on this than we were in 14-15. You know, there's a significant increase in this. It is a public health emergency, and you know, I think Ian's right. Kind of, I don't want to say it's caused by X, because you know, I'm not an expert in this, and nobody seems to have been able to exactly say. But it's a public health emergency. We need to treat it like that. We need to treat it like a public health issue, and we need to take action. I mean, you know, David's talking about the issues that they caused by the SNP government is in this, but the reality is that there's a chunk of this that is reserved to Westminster. You know, there is so much that the SNP government can do and that the Scottish Parliament can do in this, but there is a chunk of this that is reserved, and that, you know, decisions around classification and things like that, decisions around the drug consumption rooms, for example, is all taken at Westminster. You know, it would be good to have more support from Westminster.
But the Westminster policy is working in England and Wales, isn't it? I mean, if you just judge it by the figures.
Well, in that case, is it? I mean, that's an argument for independence right there. You know what? So the Westminster government should only do things that work for, you know, England and Wales, even though it's clearly not working in Scotland.
I don't think drugs deaths should be an excuse for independence, to be honest.
You know, having differential policies across the UK, if there is an issue that is differential, you know, would make sense. If the UK government want to devolve us the power to deal with it, that would be great.
Right. Let's finish off with a fun text question, which you all are looking aghast at, from Gordon, who says, this new AI bot ChatGPT can compose music and write plays, poetry, letters, essays and speeches, given a bit of prompting, and is apparently killing off school homework. What tasks will you be asking the chatbot to do for you? Keep it clean, David.
Well, Ian, it can write my memoirs, because I'm sure it would make it much more interesting than it really was.
OK, I'm not going to publish those. Kirsty?
Well, I'm a bit nervous about this, because my colleague Marco Biaggi asked it to explain who Marco Biaggi is, and it said Marco Biaggi is deceased. And so I'm a bit concerned about using this, because you might end up in a scenario where you're dead before your time, and that doesn't sound fun at all.
Maybe they'll talk about his political career, perhaps.
What a great name, though, Marco Biaggi. Wouldn't you love a name like that?
He's an excellent human being as well.
I trust your judgment on that. Gina?
Well, it would be quite nice to use it to write politicians' answers to questions that you get proper answers to, rather than the same answer every single time I have to say Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss. Oh, you asked them a question, you got the same answer. It didn't matter. It was just a different form of the
Liz
words.
Truss was a bot.
You know, they were. I mean, it's so robotic and it's so dull and boring.
Ian Murray.
I would ask it, given the earlier discussion, to write me an essay on why does Nicola Sturgeon fear a UK Labour government so much.
And it probably would be able to do that.
I'm going to try it when I get back.
Yeah, do, because I think we'd all be interested to know
question
that.
About why Tories haven't
thank you all very much indeed
and the
for
1955 general.
David Mundell, Kirsty Blackman, Iain Murray and Gina Davidson. Right, coming up in a moment, we're going to broach the thorny subject of peace in the Middle East. Yes, wish me luck on that one, because US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called for Israel and the Palestinians to take urgent steps to restore calm amid escalating violence. But if only it were that simple. So I'm going to ask you what, on the face of it, could be seen as a simplistic question. I'm going to do it anyway. What does peace in the Middle East actually look like? Lots of scope for you there. 0345 6060 973. And do you see any prospect of it happening, or do you think that both sides are going to blame each other for the escalating violence, as they always do? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, members